Hello, everyone. Can you hear me at the back of the room? Yeah? How fun was that, being outside for like 5-10 minutes in the cold? We're all good? We're all awake now that we've been outside? Okay, perfect. So my name is Kate Kimball, and I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Mi'kma'ki, and we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. The ability to offer this acknowledgement is personally special for me today, as I was actually born and raised just about an hour from here. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge my connections to the presentations today as well. Though Nova Scotia was my place of birth, for the last 13 plus years, I've actually lived, learned, worked, and played in Treaty 8 territory, which is in Fort McMurray, or Northern Alberta. The majority of my time spent in Fort McMurray was actually spent working with the vulnerable population, the homelessness population. Coming from a rural community, it is my pleasure to introduce you today to Rob Grant, who is the Executive Director from Salt Springs Community Services. Robert has worked with Salt Springs for 20 years, working in the area of rural homelessness. Salt Springs has been working with the Housing First, food programs, affordable housing, and shelter programs since they began in 15 years ago. So please join me in welcoming Rob.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, it's great to be here. I want to acknowledge I'm very happy to be visiting the Mi'kmaq territory as well, and I come from, I'm now residing on Coast Salish territory, and live in very privileged to live in a little group of islands in the Salish Sea, the largest of which is Juan, which is now has been commonly called Salt Spring Island. So I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Salt Spring, but it's the largest of the Southern Gulf Islands. And yeah, so happy to be here. I've got the centerpiece of what I wanted to kind of talk to you about was communicating about rural homelessness, and what led us a little bit to creating a video to that effect, in which I've got to show as well. And so I'd like to do that very early on. Very first is to show the video. But what I want to kind of mention first is the whole notion of rural versus urban it's kind of a moving target. It's a big continuum, and there's an obvious urban, and that's the big metro areas that we all know and love, and then there's a whole continuum, and I know, for instance, in our province, there's what I would call some sort of middle-sized communities, which are, I don't know if I'd call them urban, but they're very large population bases that are still feeling quite distanced from the metro areas. I think of a community just up, on Vancouver Island, Nanaimo, for instance, 100,000 people, still feeling that distance from the major cities as well. But having said that, I come from a community that doesn't even have a Tim Hortons. So that's a different category, I think, that is clearly rural. So I'm right down at that end of the continuum, and I think that a lot of my perspectives and perhaps some of the messaging I've got has to do with the smaller communities, like very small communities. One of the things we do in our community is we run an emergency shelter, and there may be others, I'm not quite sure, but it'll be a rural thing, I expect. There may not be that many emergency shelters. It's a 30-bed emergency shelter. It's rocking, really busy, full year round, full complement of staff, doing all those best practices to run a shelter. One of the things that we need to do is manage how the dogs that people might bring to the shelter stop disrupting the sheep from the neighbor. And so, just to kind of emphasize the rural part again. So yeah, it's a rural community, and and I don't know that it's, in some ways it's a representative community, and I can talk about that a little bit later, about some of the features around Salt Spring that is a bit of a prototype in terms of how a small community needs to deal with homelessness. And I also just have to give the caveat that we're a little bit funky and different. We have our own flag and our own currency. So no Tim Hortons, but we got those other features. So without further ado, I'm just going to try to call up our video. Oh, I'll give you the background to the video. So I was speaking a couple of years ago, got in a conversation with the executive director of the Social Planning and Research Council in BC, a woman in Vancouver, and we're talking about homelessness. They had just gotten some provincial funding to pass on to other communities and other projects, and so I connected with her, and we've gotten funding from her in the past for various things, and that was just really when. Was it COVID? It wasn't even COVID related, actually. Anyway, Vancouver was just really struggling with encampments and what they were doing and how they were dealing with some really major encampments there. And that was kind of the topic of everything. That's front page of the news. That was the focus of everything. And so as we were chatting about this, and she was explaining how they're embroiled in all this kind of dynamic, I just said, well, that's really different in our community. It's fundamentally just things are happening and looking and feeling, and we're dealing with these things in a slightly different way. And she said, well, tell that story. And I said, well, show me the money and I'll tell that story. And so she said, okay, yeah, we'll give you a grant and figure out what you'd like to do with that. And so certainly accepted some funding from Spark and went back and chatted with our team back on Salt Spring and said, I think I put my foot in my mouth. I said, I got a story to tell. And they've now said, here's some funding, so go tell it. And so that team, it was some managers, and it was people that worked in our shelter, and it was a couple of people that kind of use our services, chatted a little bit about it, and they settled on the notion of developing a video. So it was kind of wide open what we would do, but that group just said, one of the best ways we think to make it most palatable for other people, if we want people, particularly in other communities and in urban centers, to take an interest, is video is a nice format. We all know that typically videos these days are very short things. Well, they got long, but there were stories to tell. So the marching orders that I gave to that group was, there's a story to tell around our homeless situation, perhaps in contrast to the urban, but primarily it's our situation. And so the video touches a little bit on that theme of rural and urban, but basically it was a group of people that simply had the camera and the attention to be able to just kind of tell some of their stories of what it's like in our community, and it's the people that are experiencing homelessness, and also the service providers. We all share the same community, a relatively small community. So this is our story. If I can find it here, see how I do. All right, I think we're good.
This is our open concept. We're going to show all of our other sites.
Salt Spring Island is a community of 11,000 people in the southern Gulf Islands of British Columbia, just a short ferry ride away from Vancouver or Vancouver Island.
We are in one of the richest postal codes in the country, and yet that coexists with a situation where the homeless rates here per capita are the highest in BC.
Across the country, in rural communities, homeless populations are growing. While the scale of the problem doesn't rival the number in urban centers, in many smaller rural communities with few services, there is a disproportionately large number of people facing homelessness. Rural communities everywhere are experiencing variations of the same issues. On Salt Spring Island, the homeless rate has skyrocketed over the last years. The latest rate of homelessness on a per capita basis is 5 times that of Metro Vancouver. The homeless crisis on Salt Spring stems from an acute housing shortage. Gentrification, the conversion of rental housing to vacation rentals, and a failure of wages to keep pace with rising housing costs means the island faces a growing population of housing insecure people and few resources to address it.
Empathy is a lot easier when you have been there, when you have slept on a park bench, when you've slept in the cold. It's easier. So just try it. Try it for 2 hours. That's my challenge to Salt Spring.
But I've been living between like a campsite and my boat.
Whoa, you could get 10 cents per can, so.
The solutions are there, but we need to work together, and part of that is educating folks who've never had, real mental health crises, have never had addiction,
There's probably a good percentage of people who get into real big arguments just because they're hungry.
In this film, You'll meet some of the people who know firsthand what it's like to deal with housing insecurity.
I'm Riley. I was born in Victoria. Lived most of my life in Victoria. I lived with my grandma in Ontario when I was 15 and 16. Before I came here, I was homeless in Victoria for 2 years when I was a teenager. And I think like more than the actual experience of being homeless was like the experience of being constantly visible as a homeless person. Like I feel like being constantly perceived in public as a homeless person was like fucking exhausting. It's the same as, I love hanging out in the park, but it's the feeling of being perceived and viewed and judged that I find deeply unpleasant. We don't want to be there. We would rather be in a different place, like a private place. Like a lot of the people who live in houses beat their wives, are alcoholics, smoke crack, are shitty people, but they get to do it in private and we don't see it. But like when we have like some of our shittiest moments, we have to do it in public, which makes it worse.
My name is Spirit Euphoria Nicholas Gates, and I've lived on Salt Spring homelessly and on and off since I was about 16 years old. I've slept probably just about everywhere there is to sleep on the island. One of my oldest camps is still standing like 20 feet away in the background. My experience being homeless on Salt Spring was nonetheless a lot better than it would have been in any city. Growing up here, there's a sense of community and trust between people that you don't get anywhere else, and you can take that for granted unless you've left the island for a while and seen it firsthand. This is certainly the safest place for a homeless person to be, but with very little resources for the homeless people themselves.
My name's David Krishnarik, aka Beach Dave. I'm from North Burnaby, Vancouver. I grew up with my grandparents who raised me, my mom's on my mom's side. Well, I found shelter with my one vessel that I came here with, but then it started the weather started changing to cold, like from warm to cold, and I haven't really been prepared. Like I've never lived on a boat before, especially for a full year. And when it got into the fall time, there's a lot of condensation, and then it makes mold on the boat. A lot of challenges with trying to figure out how to beat the condensation on having a wet sleeping bag every night. Found that I went to land for a little bit and stayed just in a campsite. We had found a little campsite that we created, and we call it Camp Us. And a couple other guys that don't have a place to stay either. We're staying there too. So we're kind of like a little kind of community. We have our little cook stove, and we have our little everything like as a team. Somebody brings the spaghetti sauce, and somebody else brings the spaghetti. But between the three of us, we were getting by with looking out for each other. And then I stay on the boat a couple days a week when I was feeling like being out in the water.
My name's Adam Joseph Logier. I was born in London, Ontario, and raised in that area. The community essentially saved my life. I came here, I didn't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. I was starting fresh. I mean, at one point, a lot of us have had the world by the short and curlies, and through no fault of our own sometimes, mitigating factors and extenuating circumstances, you find yourself in a position where you have nothing and you have to start anew. Rural living, having places, transportation, weather, all these different factors come into play.
I go by Nico, but my name is Nicole. I've been in BC for 25 years. It might not have been Salt Spring, but, you know, I think I deserve to be somewhere. But this is happening everywhere. It's all over Canada, it's just not here. Like, how is anyone supposed to know where to go or where to be able to afford to be alive?
My name is Toto Andre. A little bit about me. Born in Nairobi, Kenya. Grew up in Fort McMurray. And I came from Calgary. I got a crash course on the housing situation here on Salt Spring, which though is a macro-micro thing, it's happening everywhere. It's very heightened here. There are a lot of people who are housing insecure on this island, heightened by high prices, and then you have awkward situations, people just trying to make it work, buffered against weird regulations that don't enable that to happen, that work against it. The structures that are in place right now, and it probably is very endemic across the country, is just unaffordable. Unaffordable housing, lack of space and room, and that's only getting worse.
Mental health and addictions issues go hand in hand. The lack of housing or shelter weighs heavily on people's ability to cope with mental illnesses and recover from addictions.
Anything that traumatizes us that we experience repeatedly is going to become a big trigger for us. So for a lot of folks who've been homeless for a long time, they're continually re-traumatized as they're displaced. On average, somebody who's spent a significant amount of time on the street has gone through trauma that is almost unfathomable. The consistency with which the stories of childhood and then of things people experience on the street or with abusive partners is harrowing. And it is totally normal in that situation to self-medicate. It's just what people do. It's a way for you to take control a little bit of how you feel. Trauma and then the inability to form trusting social connections because of trauma is the primary driver of addiction.
Mental health brings people sometimes to a place where they can't get back on their feet, and you just end up there. To not even feel safe to have a home or a community can really be scary for people. So maybe to turn to something that takes those thoughts away or takes the pain away is why people end up where they end up. And if anyone could just remember that, we all should have more compassion for others, so we don't know what they've been through.
The availability of housing or shelter is a major determinant of health. Provision of shelter and housing is a first step in the road to recovery for many.
What we see with people that do have mental health challenges and substance use issues is when they have stable housing, they're able to access supports and they're better able to have positive outcomes, and we see a vast improvement in their life overall. As long as they have the support and they have a roof over their head, they do a lot better.
When mental health and addiction issues are paired with homelessness in a community with sparse resources to respond, people can often be left out on their own to manage an unmanageable situation. On Salt Spring Island, as in many other rural places, the few resources available are in much higher demand.
And in terms of homelessness, where mental health and substance use is pretty common, and that's part of the whole kind of formula, we, as many other rural communities, are seriously underserved. We don't have any specialized services. It's so narrow that there's a team through our health authority that can provide kind of a generic response, but none of the specialized services that would probably be required if you had a fully fleshed out continuum of services here.
I value the work that Island Health is providing. Definitely they have capacity. They require a lot of, they have a high demand for their services, and so there are some challenges there in terms of accessing the supports, but the people that we work with, social workers, forensic nurse examiners at the hospital, and the mental health substance use team, there definitely is a real spirit of collaboration, which is positive.
It's like a perfect storm. So when you say there's not enough shelter, there definitely is not enough mental health resources here. We don't have the capacity to respond. Addiction services, we don't have supportive recovery. We don't have detox. We don't have those kinds of services here. Our policing level that help to kind of organize our community a little bit and then can be supportive. We're understaffed in that particular way. Our hospital is not prepared for homeless people with chronic health conditions, and so when you add all those up, we are just behind the 8 ball because they accumulate to be very weak safety net in the community in general.
On Salt Spring, the government-funded services that are available through programs designed to serve the homeless population can be traced to just a couple of service providers.
Our organization has been around since 1992, and we operate on Salt Spring Island and provide services to the Southern Gulf Islands area. We are an organization that primarily works towards anti-violence services for women and children who are experiencing violence and abuse. So this looks like outreach, counseling services, transitional housing, additional referrals and access to support services with our partner agencies.
Our services have been around for 45 years, and Salt Spring Community Services is a key resource for the community and for all sorts of people in the community. We have services for all populations, from early childhood to family and teens and adults and seniors. Our organization has been involved in pretty specific ways with the homeless and insecure housed for the last 15 years. Our strategy to get involved and be a better resource for the homeless followed numerous paths. When it became really apparent about 15 years ago that this was a really, growing to be a community priority, with the rising numbers of people that are housing insecure, our services just got bigger and bigger. So our housing, our shelter, and our food programs have just tripled and quadrupled over the last number of years.
I work at the shelter. I worked at the shelter for like 2 or 3 years in various manifestations of the shelter. Like, it's been very different. We've moved buildings. We've changed our program delivery a lot. It's kind of like the only show in town. Like, community services has lots of different programs. They have a lot of food programs. They have programs for adults with disabilities. They have programs for seniors. But yeah, the program that I work in deals with adult homelessness specifically. And I think that it's great. Like, I think that it's really good. We have a lot of folks who come through from other places like Duncan or Victoria or Vancouver, and they're like, this is like really cool. Like, this is the coolest shelter I've ever seen. But it's also very Salt Spring. The first year I worked there, we closed in April, and we would do dinner, like community dinner, and then we would open up at 7. So we were pretty much open from 7 at night, and then we would kick folks out at like 8 or 9 a.m., I think. And then the next year we were open all year round, but we were still closed during the daytime. And then we ended up buying the building that was behind the small little shelter. So the shelter used to take place in this like 1-story, like it was really little. Like, it was very, very small. We had like 1 bathroom, 1 shower, little tiny office, and then bunk beds, like dorm style bunk beds. And our capacity was probably about 20 people. So then we bought the building behind that, and our capacity there is about 30, but it's a lot bigger. We have 3 bathrooms, like 2 floors. We have like a kitchen, like an actual kitchen. We didn't have that before. We just had a microwave and like a hot plate kind of thing. So yeah, we pretty much went from being an emergency cold weather winter shelter to being 24/7 year round, just open all of the time, except for 2 hours a day where we clean. We're low barrier, and specifically because we're the only shelter on Salt Spring other than the transition house, we have to be low barrier. So we accept pets, we accept couples, we accept folks who are like using, folks who come home drunk. Like, the rules are just like, please don't use your drugs on the property, and please don't like drink beer on the property. But if you're high or drunk, you can like come home, absolutely. So we're super low barrier in that way. But we don't have the wraparound supports that the city would have. Like, we don't have an ACT team, we don't have a psychiatrist, we don't have pretty much we can call the cops or an ambulance, and then also sometimes they won't even come because we're staffed and they're short-staffed.
The model of housing first is to provide housing and supports. But part of the nature of the housing stock in rural communities is a clear and definite limit to availability. Smaller communities face unique difficulties in creating more housing.
Still maintain that housing first model, which is simply housing plus supports. You can't have one without the other. They both have to work in tandem, becomes fundamental to everything that we do.
We help people obtain and retain housing. We also believe the philosophy of that program is that everyone has a right to housing. So people do not need to be ready for housing. Once their housing is stable, they then can work on their mental health and any substance use issues they may have. So what I have to say about housing first is that it has been extremely challenging here on the island right now to find housing for people. A lot of homelessness right now, as well as people living in a great deal of substandard housing. So what we see with that is people experiencing conditions of, pest infestation, mold, living in RVs without windows and without doors and making do in the cold weather, having no amenities such as water and sewer, groups of people living in chicken coops, for example. So those are situations that exist here on the island, and people pay good rent money for those types of housing because there isn't anything else available. It's either that, they stay, or they are homeless.
Our housing stock here is different than in urban centers. In an urban center, you're typically going to find probably half the housing to be multifamily, and within that multifamily housing, you're going to find single room occupancy and motels and different kind of forms of housing that are affordable. In a lot of rural communities, and certainly on Salt Spring, our housing stock is about 80% single family dwellings. So that's just not part of housing disadvantaged people. So we've got a very small, narrow part of our housing stock that's even available. And so within that, we've got a very narrow opportunity to find options for people. There simply isn't that many options.
Locally on Salt Spring Island, I think we have seen some growth and successes in terms of other housing projects. Salt Spring Island Community Services with their Salt Spring Commons project, iWave with our Croftonburg project. There are a couple other projects in the mix. And some of the new initiatives are really challenged by access to water and sort of local infrastructure, whether it's roads or sewer or water. Those are some of the barriers to new projects coming online in a timely way. So I think maybe it's not a gap, but it's maybe a barrier or a reality in our communities. It takes a really long time to develop housing in this rural environment. In urban centers where there might be city land given, there's infrastructure to connect into hydro and sewer and water in a really easy way. Those aren't considerations that other housing providers or developers are having to take into consideration, but also add into their timeline.
In other instances, it is the unique challenges and the glaring absence of facilities, services, and infrastructure that need to be considered when alternatives and priorities are evaluated. One basic human need, and one that's missing for people experiencing homelessness in smaller communities, is a simple notion of having somewhere to be. Lacking drop-in centers, and with very limited public indoor spaces, those living rough or in substandard shelter face a very challenging circumstance. On Salt Spring, some of those people attempted to create a space to provide the basic necessities of food and shelter in the winter of 2021 to 22. They called it the warming space. Without any officially sanctioned status, the warming space set up in public parks It was dismantled and moved repeatedly as the group faced bylaw enforcement with zero tolerance for camping in public parks.
Originally as an emergency response to quite extreme weather for Salt Spring on Christmas Day, and that's when everything got snowed over and icy and frozen, and it hit -12, -10.
Yeah, this winter we had here in Salt Spring was out of this world. Especially for we went through the fall time, and it was so many storms. Like my boat got majorly beat up. There was so much going on with like hurricane-style winds and all this stuff that was not prepared for. One time I came to shore and I went to get my skiff and come back out, and the whole part of the ocean was frozen. And I thought, okay, I'll stay at the warming space because it was a place where I could stay and be around people and not feel so alone. And especially through New Year's and Christmas really saved me, especially with my mental health. I didn't feel so alone. I didn't feel like I had nobody. I felt like I had family and friends there. And I was warm, so that was good.
It gets chilly, and a lot of people don't have anywhere to go during the day sometimes, whether you're involved with community services and are staying at the shelter, which is a great place, might I add. They open up a warming space. I was included in that. Some good friends of mine were involved, and set up a tent, food, shelter, 24/7. You need to warm up. It's cold outside. It's a safe place, a really safe place.
Week 1, snowing, setting up, learning. We were supposed to only be there for 1 or 2 days, and then even nature, having frozen our tent poles together, was like, no, you got to stay, and we stayed a week. That was the first iteration of the warming space.
It felt like when we started that it was important enough to continue. This is really a project which started from the ground up with volunteerism. The members of the warming space are the ones who work on it, make sure it's running. There's been a lot of energy and time, but one thing that I've been really impressed by is the initiative that people have shown in making sure this is continuing to happen. And I think it's because people felt on a very deep level that something important was happening. Usually in winter, folks get a little more isolated. The nature of living in a rural or semi-rural community is there aren't many places to go after a certain hour of night. There's the public library, there's the pool, there's businesses, but, a place where you can just be with others. It's brought a lot of interesting things up in terms of what it means to run a project like this on a grassroots level.
The warming space is an awesome little kind of microcosm of like what is possible and some of the struggles that we have to achieving it.
The lack of indoor space for the homeless population and the conditions that are particular to this island community define what the needs really are on the ground.
I feel like the importance of this space is not just the physical needs of warmth, but the needs of social gathering space. The one impression I have of witnessing what's happened with the warming space is it's been a real healing space for a lot of people. It's definitely affected in a positive way a lot of people's mental health, to have a place to go to, a place where they can let their shoulders down. And because of the sustained amount of time we had, it deepened relationships and allowed for people to support each other.
While smaller communities provide unique challenges that set them apart from urban centers, they also present opportunities if the planning, the programs, and the service delivery are all carried out with the particular community in mind. On Salt Spring Island, with a broad swath of social services carried out by one agency, solutions can sometimes be found by combining service areas.
More opportunities to empower people who are marginalized to do things that they love. That's the healing journey. We have one right now in Burgoyne Bay through Community Services where you can where you can come work on a farm, you get paid.
And over the years, as an attempt to get more fresh produce available for the food bank, they began gardening at Community Services, and that's expanded until we ended up having a space here at the Burgoyne Bay Community Farmlands. And so now we've got an acre in production that's being grown to be distributed through the food bank directly, and also goes to the Harvest Kitchen. And the Harvest Kitchen is preparing foods for many different programs within Community Services. It would be great to see just more participant involvement all around in the food programs. If we had the facilities where people who are underhoused or homeless and don't have access to facilities to do their own cooking, or don't have access to land to grow their own food. And it would be great to start to bring those pieces together, where instead of it's a handout model, it would be great to have that broader participation and the support network to make that happen, so that people can provide for themselves.
Like if we could have a community place where everybody has a place to go if they're cold, that gave me hope. Our meals in the park, like Frank's Burgers, knowing that like if I missed a meal or something, I can go, and every Sunday I can get a meal go to have a burger with Frank in the park, or get a warm bowl of soup from Joe. And now I'm doing my own like Beach Dave raw oysters on the boardwalk. I'm going to do seafood too, so I know other people are going to keep doing that in the future. Like somebody else is going to see us doing that and go, hey, I'm going to do my own little my own little sushi bar or something or whatever. Like it's going to inspire other people to want to share their foods and their community with their community here.
You know, we need a safe dinghy dock. Like I think that like liveaboards exist, and trying to pretend that they don't exist is not very helpful. I think that the park needs 24-hour bathrooms, maybe showers, that'd be rad. I think that a lot of people live in vans. A lot of people live in vans and trailers, and I think that if we just had a pay-what-you-can trailer park with like facilities.
Personally, what I'd like to see for myself is more resources that get me involved with making some progress towards my future and my goals. I'd like to certainly find a stable housing situation where I can feel secure and safe in that housing, and not feel like in 3 weeks something unbeknownst to me is going to happen that's going to make it so that I can't have a home anymore. You know, I'd like to hold down a home for a few years, and there's not a lot of resources on the island that can ensure that kind of situation.
What I would hope to see as a solution would be definitely more affordable housing stock here on the island. People that are experiencing poverty are definitely challenged, but even the middle income having a great deal of difficulty paying rent. And we have people coming to Housing First looking for subsidies that are in positions on the island and are not unemployed, and they cannot make the ends meet, and they need assistance with their with subsidies, with making their rent when they're falling behind, and they too are facing homelessness.
British Columbia has the smallest proportion of people living in rural areas of any province in Canada, which means that homelessness programs are largely focused on urban-centered conditions. Having identified some of the ways forward, the question becomes, how do we get there from here?
One of the starting points, I think, for working with other partners, particularly partners off island, and looking at provincial resources and regional resources, is coming up with a common understanding about what the need is. And I think there's a fundamental difference in starting point where sometimes homelessness in a rural community just looks very different than in an urban center, and that creates already a kind of a starting point of maybe misunderstanding. The downtown east side or Pandora Street in Victoria are almost like the poster description of and everyone's vision of what homelessness looks like. And that's a starting point, and those particular communities are really, it's a desperate situation, and it really is visceral, and people kind of experience that. And when you come to our community, you don't see that. The population of homeless in our community is dispersed in many different ways across the community, in lots of hidden or obscure places, in vehicles and boats and derelict buildings, and buildings on big properties or acreages where people are camped out, and so it's not quite as apparent. Most of the broader planning in our region and in our province happens outside of our community. The general directions and resources and strategies to deal with homelessness in BC happens outside and beyond Salt Spring Island or and I think also other rural communities. So we have a model to follow and to rely on that is predominantly urban-based and a centralized model. As the greater system is presenting solutions, as these are urban based solutions, even when they do become available to us in smaller communities, and in our community, they don't necessarily fit. And this gets back to planning with a small community rural focus. We don't have the critical mass of people with psychiatric issues and addictions issues to rationalize large-scale programs. So we need to do it in different kinds of ways. The way we get organized to do that is to find local solutions in very small doses, different kinds of ways to address those small issues, rather than kind of ignoring those because, well, we don't have enough. We don't have enough people with very complex psychiatric issues to come up with a big-scale psychiatric program, so we'll just leave it. We still have those people in the community, and we need to find different ways.
Let's use the incredible ingenuity we have with all these diverse community members, such different perspectives. I think of each perspective as like a snapshot. If you put everybody's perspective in the community into one picture, that's the mosaic that's actually us. And I think from there we can navigate all of this.
So I quiet down, listen to my heart. I make a whole out of all the parts. I find myself in everyone I see. It's all right there looking back at me.
So that's it. A comment, Spirit, the young fellow that was one of the features in there, a big part of what we used funding for was he was on a bit of an apprenticeship thing. He did most of the filming and learned how to film along the way with, it was actually one of the board members of our organization who's a very good filmmaker. He took it on to kind of lead Spirit through it. And then Toto did a lot of the script. A well-spoken man, and so those two got healthy honorariums to kind of run the show, and I just think they did a great job. Yeah. another, actually, an unfortunate thing is, one of the things, a point I wanted to make was in rural communities, and the film talks about that, about how it just looks a little bit different. But what we found over the last couple of years is weather really is really impactful. It is everywhere, but certainly in a rural community, when winter comes, it's harsh. And so we go from a situation where the homeless are less visible and pretty dispersed to collect, and it always happens in around this time of year. There's more hanging out together, bigger crowds in the parks, people coming together to share meals. Like, a lot of that's happening. And 2 years ago, the warming space got nowhere. It was like whack-a-mole with them getting their camps pulled down and not happening. Last year was a bit of a disaster again. This year, the kind of the grassroots of that movement had located another place. It was on our local regional district property. They collected and moved some vehicles on there and tents and that kind of thing. And we didn't know how it was going to go this year. I've actually been touring Nova Scotia for the last 10 days, so I didn't know what was happening, and just got emails just yesterday that they've been given trespassing orders. RCMP were there, full-on eviction to nowhere. Like, I'm not, so next week when I get back to Salt Spring, where we've got, the same situation about where in winter now can that kind of collection of people go. Part of it is they're not new, though. They've always been around, just dispersed in the community. It's just in winter it was that need for kind of warming. So, yeah. One of the things I should comment about Salt Spring is, and homelessness, to make it kind of a feature community, I find in some kind of ways is, geographically, we're pretty intact as a community because there's ocean everywhere. We're a community of about 10,000 or 11,000 people, and which isn't huge. It hangs together as one consolidated community in a lot of ways. We all shop at the same stores, and everyone's kind of together as the same community. And but it's large enough that it's a complex community. There's lots kind of going on there, and politically, we're not a municipality. We're the Wild West, I guess. We're an unorganized land, and so we have been assigned politically to be part of the Capital Regional District, which is predominantly urban municipalities. It's like 13 different municipalities and the unincorporated areas. So what it does is it puts us right into the middle of a metro, urban, metropolitan political system. But we're not part of that particular community. And historically, Salt Spring's always had a healthy number of people that are unsheltered. Back in the 70s and 60s, there was people that were kind of dropping out, moving north from the States, and kind of seeking refuge or living off the grid. And so there's always been, I would say, probably 50 or 60 people that have been really unsheltered through the 60s, and then that really started growing with economic times changing. And right now, it's not so much the alternate lifestyle anymore. There's just full-on, typical poverty-driven homelessness that's happening. And our most recent count, I think the graphic on there show it topped out at 146. We just finished our count for this last year, and it's up to 165. So it's pretty high for a community of around 11,000 people. That's 1 in every 70 people. I haven't actually seen a point-in-time count anywhere close to that anywhere. So I don't know if it's the highest in the country, but I haven't seen anything different there. And so we really are challenges as a community. So when I start thinking about, and one of the reasons we did this video was it really had to do with how do we talk about this? Because I think this may be common in other rural communities where there's homelessness, and now there's a bit of dialogue that homelessness isn't just an urban problem. How do you talk about the rural problem? I don't think we can just talk amongst ourselves now. Like, we have to talk, like, the rural people and the urban people need to kind of come on the same page around this sort of thing. It can't be defined by each in their own particular way. We've, in my many years now doing this, I find that we can sit around with people from the urban center and we talk about the same issues and walk away and realize we are talking about it in two very, very different kind of ways. And somehow there needs to be a way of having a common narrative. And neither side dominates that. It's got to be kind of a mutual kind of development of what the understanding is around that. So a couple of things, what I kind of talk about, a couple of different paradigms. It's the elephant and the mouse thing I often think about. Like the urban, BC's got, I think 14% of BC is technically rural, which is, I think, is under $40,000 or 40,000 people in a community. So that's only 14% of the population. So that is pretty small compared to the bulk of the population. In our particular situation, we are about 3% of the population of the Capital Regional District. So 97% is urban, and then there's us 3%. But we are kind of bound together by this kind of common geographic boundary. And so I start thinking about the elephant and the mouse just simply as the size, or based on size. Okay, so an elephant and a mouse, and I'm presuming with the elephant and the mouse, it's the same zookeeper that's caring for that little living environment. And so that zookeeper is caring for an elephant and a mouse. So you got to know that the elephant's the priority. Who wants an angry, hungry, needy elephant? You probably got to know there's a lot of bulk buying to feed that elephant, because that's a lot of Costco trips to get everything going on there. And as stuff gets peeled off to the side, there's a little bit for the mouse. You know, you can kind of keep that mouse fed with what the elephant isn't going to eat. Maybe. Depends on how hungry that elephant happens to be. One of the features about the elephant and the mouse is when you start talking about the relationship, because I think it really has to do with the relationship between the two. The elephant, in relation to that mouse, the elephant's got a cute little friend, or the elephant's got a little perturbing little pest, or most of the time, the mouse really doesn't exist for the elephant. And for the mouse, every waking hour and half of the sleeping hours is close, vigilant attention to what's the elephant doing. Life depends on it to make sure. So that mouse knows the elephant better than the elephant even knows itself. And that's kind of been like, anyway, that's a metaphor to capture my last 20 years of work. I'm pretty pro mouse, because I think mice are pretty bright, pretty resilient, don't need a lot, and actually, really, in the end, shouldn't be housed with an elephant. But anyway, the other kind of metaphor is, and I want to be careful with this one, but it's around the colonial aspect of what's going on there. And at first I was thinking, is this a parent-child sort of relationship? And that didn't go far enough. It's kind of more significant and deeper than simply being a parent and child. It's got some of the trappings of a colonial relationship. And what I mean by that is as we interact, I think, as rural communities, and certainly in my experience with ours, in such close proximity to the urban centers, it's a very unbalanced relationship. It's a relationship where there's a dominant element in the relationship, and then a not so dominant in the relationship, and that typically in any kind of relationship anywhere, it doesn't end well. I mean, that's not a healthy relationship, and one of the things that happens in that situation is I think that the dominant part of that relationship, it's dominated not only by size, but it's dominated because all resources for the other party flow through the dominant party. Decisions are made, all the influence is held there, and it's kind of passed on at their will. And over time, and that's kind of, I do think that's a fact, and that's not even a bad fact. If that was acknowledged and recognized and you worked with that dynamic, that'd be one thing. But I think that where it comes in, and I'm bringing up that colonial word, is that over enough time living in that reality, really good people, this isn't a slam on people that work in the urban environment, it's just even good people start thinking that they need to care for these dependent people in the rural areas, that they actually are smarter and brighter and have more answers and more solutions, and if anything, they can assume a role of being a teacher or a mentor, and it's just not the case. That just does not turn out well, and we know that how deep that can go in terms of enmeshing on both parts a feeling of superiority and inferiority. And I've seen that in living proof with my people, with all the people I've worked with, and myself as I've interacted. I had to check myself many times as I walked away from meetings and just thinking, well, gosh, we're just, who are we, kind of thing. And then I went, no, wait a second. We've got solutions, we've got answers, there's things we need to do. But what I found over the years is part of that colonial kind of mindset is somehow it's baked into the whole scenario is the dominant party there has a real vested interest in maintaining that dominance, whether they recognize it or not, and would probably very much deny that and maybe don't even feel it, but it's just kind of so baked in that there's very, very little attention to capacity building and passing on the ability to make decisions to the other party, simply because it's so understood that it's not their job. The larger community's job is to care for that small community. And so there's even situations I've certainly experienced where it's the classic colonial thing where someone from the colonial headmasters are heading off to quell there's an uprising in the colonies, and you need to go put it to rest, and the colonies are getting a little uppity and starting to think that they can do things for themselves. Have been part of situations where things that our community has wanted to do have just been stillborn because they just aren't taken seriously. So anyway, it might sound a little dramatic, the colonial piece, but that's where I'm at this year anyway with it.
You'd love to ask questions, Rob?
We're going to do questions maybe.
Yeah, it's up to you.
And yeah.
The presentation will be done today at 5:15, and it's 4:41.
Okay. Yeah. Why don't you wait? And it'll throw me way off my cards if. So yeah, a point I want to emphasize, and I think the film or the video did this, was to talk about what it can look like, and what the actual emotional feeling of looking at a homeless encampment on a major city like the downtown east side in Vancouver. If you want someone to get impacted by homelessness, you just have to show them a picture. It's just like so concentrated and so visceral. And we just don't have that in our community, and it's different. It lays itself out differently, and it's very dispersed. And so that dramatic effect. So there's been times when I have ended up hosting people onto our island, and part of the premise coming over to our island is, hey, there's a homeless issue over there. There's got to be a meeting of the minds, and people need to start talking about this. And the first thing in my heart just sinks is people will arrive and say, okay, well, show us where they are. And sorry, we'll go by the parks and they're not there. They're all hidden away. They're in different places. They're in vehicles down there. They're just dispersed very broadly. The one concentrated part homeless population in our community year-round is in boats, which again was the first time this was raised on Salt Spring. It was communicated as part of our point-in-time count. I can't remember exactly the comment, but someone had said, that's living on a boat. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? And we're talking about, so our point-in-time count covers the boats that are not in proper moorage with services. Most of the boats are not seaworthy. The odd one is, but it is a death trap. Our floating homeless community is probably one of the dangerous places that I know of. The police won't even attend to emergency calls out there unless they can get the Coast Guard to go with them. They've got a boat themselves, but they won't go out unless there's two boats. And officers have just said, I'm going out there in the middle of the night, and there might have been a call about a domestic violence or something like that. I don't know. I'm not going to step off my boat. I don't even know what I'm getting into. And we've had people, probably one per year, die in the harbor or in their boat through exposure or through drowning. And in the harsh winter, we typically try to keep a few of our shelter beds always available because I'm not sure, it's not every year, but every second or third year, we'll have a boat go over in a storm. And we're a good hike away from the main harbor up to our shelter. It's about 1 kilometer, but 3 o'clock in the morning, knock on the door, dripping wet, their boat's done. It's gone to the bottom of the harbor. So that particular mode of finding shelter is our most dominant place. It's more than the vans and more than tents. It's out on boats. And so that's a pretty big stat for us. But yet I don't kind of know that in the community. It's so obvious to us. But it's kind of hard when people come over for a fair weather trip and they see boats bobbing around in the harbor and say, yeah, there's people living out there. And it looks kind of nice. So one of the things that I just did want to note that there's something I think referred to as hidden homelessness, and that's what I'm referring to with the disbursement. I think hidden homelessness is typically referring to couch surfing and in those kind of settings, and it's about being visible or not. We have a boardwalk in a couple of different places that kind of go along our beaches, and we've typically have people living under the boardwalk. And I'm just thinking in most of the urban environments I'm aware of, the sidewalks are where people are setting up tents, and so people will be living on the boardwalk, and our homeless folks live under the boardwalk. And it's kind of a different thing. Rarely, we've got a concentration of people causing the community such grief because they occupy some of the public parks during the day and they're drinking and they have dogs that aren't well cared for and around, but they don't. There's no tents there. No one stays there. They socialize in public spaces and then they're gone off to wherever they might have been able to find a little bit of shelter. And it's just hit me again just the other day thinking about the warming space that I used to say that's the norm, but now it's coming more clearly to me that in wintertime, there's that real natural piece of let's all get together now. And in terms of encampment, I think that our folks that are homeless probably are self-selecting to say, let's pull together an encampment in winter and then disperse again in spring. I did want to comment a little story about that colonial mindset. And there's some real obvious ones. There's nasty stories about colonialism, but it can be very, very subtle. And I think it's probably more important when it's not really, really obvious, when it's kind of subtle. There was it's a tiny little story, but it illustrates for me a big point in how I see the whole situation is there was a couple of people from Victoria, someone working for BC Housing, someone working for the Health Authority. And there was an agreement that they were going to come over to our community and we were going to have a little connection around I think it was health services was the topic, health services to vulnerable populations. And so there was no real agenda other than let's connect and talk. And so they arrived in Salt Spring and arrived at our office. And one of the first things that happened was I gave them a tour around and they went up to our shelter, which you've seen the pictures of there, and it could have been wonderful, Riley, that gave the tour kind of thing, and would have talked about the process and how things happen there. And we were leaving the shelter, and these two people were kind of lagging behind a little bit, and I was walking out. I heard one of them say to the other, looks like we're going to do the learning today. And I walked and went, whoa, was that a lot that was just said there? There was nothing about the organization of that meeting that had anything to do with them coming over to do any teaching. But the other piece was I admire the person that said that. I know her really well. I worked for years. I just thought, what good insights that she caught herself on that. I don't know if she saw the bigger part of that, but that was great of her because in most situations, that may not even have happened. Could have been just burrowing through and said, yeah, whatever. When do we get to teach them what we need, what we know? But in that moment, I just thought, well, there, So anyway, subtle. Kind of that parent-child or that colonial thinking was there. One of the things I want to bring up, in my experience with our homelessness, and I believe this would probably be true in other rural communities, is there's a kind of a difference in the community impact. What we find in our community is that there's a saturating impact on the entire community having the homeless be homeless in our community. And in our community, we got like 165 in a community of 10,000 people. Our community only has 2 grocery stores to shop at. We have 1 road that goes through the whole community. We got a couple of different parks. So when we have that amount of people in the community, you don't spend a day. Probably anyone in the community cannot go a day or 2 out in the community without interacting, or not interacting, but coming in contact with someone that's unsheltered or homeless. It's just everywhere. And so it becomes more than just an intellectual exercise. In an urban center, most homelessness is contained to the core area. I know I've lived in Victoria and realized I could live my whole life in Victoria and never come near a homeless person. I just have to go down this street rather than that one. And at best, I don't even have to get out of my car. However, I can be shocked when I go down Yates Street and Pandora Street and see all the tents and think that our government should do something about this. In our community, it's not about that. It's people either being very sympathetic and empathetic as they connect and chat with homeless people as they go into the store, or fearing going into the store because those are homeless people and I think I'm going to get knifed in the back or whatever else. It's very, very immediate. And so there's complex levels where it's hitting our whole community, where it's not just intellectual thoughts about social justice. It's very real contact on a daily basis. And the whole the way I would describe it is the notion of NIMBYism. What I've observed in seeing how that plays out in urban centers is it's very specific when there's a particular project, a social housing initiative or a camp somewhere, and the immediate people that are impacted are very much flashpoint. And really, this cannot happen in our immediate vicinity. It just has to get out of my sight. I would say in our community, we'd have a very low level of NIMBYism that kind of comes out, but it's a slow, steady burn. Slow, steady burn. It's one of those underground fires that pop up, and when it pops up, it's wicked. But for the most time, the community has a sense of balance, and there's not much said, but every single person in the community has a slow burn about what's going on. And it really can complicate things, and I've been surprised as hell sometimes, so for community services, there's often times where we're the darlings of the community, and the kind of services we do, we get great support from the community, and then that can turn on a dime when someone who, particularly if someone is a transient homeless person has entered the community and acted out in a store or something like that, social media goes nuts. And, our community, everything from our organization to me personally have been named as culprits in that whole situation. So sometimes there's a thought in our community of what we're very welcoming, and I expect most small communities have a warmth and a connection and a sense of community there, but there's a NIMBY thing that needs to be accounted for that's pretty strong to have to address. Another point I wanted to make is connection to the community. This is broad generalizations, just from me though. We have our own flag and currency, so I can have my own unique ideas here as well too. I do believe that people in smaller communities have a stronger sense and connection to the community, and I think one of the bits of evidence would be someone living in an urban environment will tend to have a very strong commitment and affinity to their neighborhood, and so we will naturally find smaller communities to be connected to. In our case, and so for instance, in a large city, that huge encampment of people in the core area, for someone living in the suburbs, they can say, well, thankfully, that's not my community, though. I mean, it's kind of ruining my city, but I've got my community, and they better not just come into my area here. What's happened in our urban or in our rural community is we all share the same community. There's not sub parts of it. Is we all share the very same space all of the time. And one of the things I've heard from both sides of the scenario, the people that are very challenged by having homeless, and then the homeless themselves, is they both are passionately connected to our community. And there's almost like a tug of war about, well, who owns the community? And this is our community, and you hear the same rhetoric coming from both sides at either end. And then I start thinking about that with our staff, with our employees. And I was thinking, actually, I thought this as I was flying over the country, leaving my reality behind, and thought, well, you know what I just thought of was that, like in my organization, there's 4 people that are kind of the managers level of everything that we do in the homeless sectors. Myself, and I have a program director, and I have a coordinator of our Housing First services, and a coordinator of our emergency shelter. All of us long-term Salt Spring residents. In our particular jobs, we have about 55 years of experience. We're averaging probably 11 or 12 years of experience average across that particular group. We interact with BC Housing, which is the primary funder of a lot of these services. So in the last 3 years, we have interacted with 11 different people from BC Housing. It's been a kind of a rotating door. Right now, I think the longest tenure anyone that we've connected with that has had a connection with our community is 14 months. And so we sit around in this whole notion of let's plan together and work around our community. We've got all the history, all the commitment to our community. We've got all the money, and we make all the decisions. And it really gets to be, and again, I don't even think that's bad as long as you name it, you understand it, and you use it. Like you really capitalize on that. But it's never kind of spoken of or addressed. So anyway, that gets to why we did the film. It's taking off points to be able to talk about some of this stuff. And the audience for this particular film is not other people from rural communities that can watch it and go, oh, I recognize that. It's around someone from an urban setting that never even thought about that, you know, that there's a richness and depth in the local communities. You know, the people are connected and know their communities quite well. How is my time for?
4 minutes left.
Okay.
2 minutes of questions.
4. I'll jump right to, I'm passing over all my slides here. I guess just to kind of summarize where I was kind of going with this, I think that in talking about what are the solutions to the rural, I think it starts with some underlying fundamental things that's everyone's work to do. And then from fundamentally shifting some of the foundational pieces, there's solutions that'll come. So I think jumping to solutions is a little premature unless you really hit the foundational pieces. And I do think that part of it is understanding what the relationship is like between rural communities and the other people that they have to engage with to do planning, which predominantly is urban folks. The underlying context, the narratives, if you want to go as far as talk about colonial attitudes or not, but I think it can go as far as certainly talking about dependency or not. That parent-child thing is so obvious. It's so easy to talk about, and getting that out on the table and really talking about that and making sure that those kind of discussions happen in the right time at the right places, not to beat anyone over the head with it, but just to be real about what the relationship is really like. And that gets to a dialogue around what is the relationship between an urban and a rural area, because I do think that there can be some fundamental kind of rules of the road in managing that. You know, something as simple as, I'm not sure how it happens in other provinces, but in BC, typically we'll get a centralized homeless program or idea or strategy that applies to the whole entire province. Hit the pause button for a second and just say, how much of this is scalable? What we just came up with, because it grew out of our community, it grew out of an urban community, could be the greatest idea ever. Is it scalable to smaller communities? If it is, perfect. Let's factor that into the whole plan. If it's not, then don't even pretend that it's province-wide. Let it sit there as a good urban, but do that little screen at the first, because I do think a lot of stuff is scalable and some stuff isn't, but that conversation doesn't happen at the earliest point where it really should. And it should just be understood. That's what we do in our relationship. I think a lot more focus should be on local empowerment and capacity building. In our community, I think that the devolution of where decisions made, the power over our own budgets, the ability to make decisions, the ability to actually take control over the process. You know, like I think that we need to assert ourselves to say we do know how to run meetings. We do know how to have a good process. We know how to do needs assessments. We can do these things. And if you give control, I'm already acting like I'm inferior here. Please give us control. We just should take control and make those decisions and kind of step up and say, we know our community, we know the things that can happen, and be assertive and kind of demand that we are resourced to be able to do that. So planning dollars and all the different behind the scenes stuff that happen to do the planning is costly. And that needs to be devolved to our community so we can afford to do that as well. And part of it is just at the broader level. I think rural interest should be at the policy table. One of the interesting things was when I had actually put this proposal in to do this presentation at the conference, I think I submitted it under the policy category, and I was disappointed that it ended up in the rural one, although it's fine. I got over that, but I just... Yeah, when we spoke about that before. So part of it is the rural communities need to sit at the adult table. You know, talking amongst ourselves is fine. But I think that when policy comes, you can't get there in the second stage. You have to be right at the first stage, right away. And so there's a time and a place for all sorts of perhaps sub-focuses and specific interests to kind of gather together. But a community is a community is a community. And so the rural community needs to be able to have its place as a community first and add on rural after, because it's got some nuances, just like every community is going to have its particular nuances. So, yeah. Yeah, so that's... Questions?
There is a microphone that will be passed around just because these sessions are recorded. So if you do have a question, please talk into the microphone.
Hi, Rob. My name is Habay Fadaldoso. I'm on the board of a brand new shelter opening up in northeastern Ontario, 10,000 people, right. 12 beds, called Zach's Crib. And we haven't opened the doors yet. That's coming up in about a month's time. Yeah. You've touched part of my point, but I'm still curious. So we're presently enjoying a very high level of community support, yeah. But that's because it's a vision. There hasn't been any realities. Yeah. And my question to you is, what would you suggest as best practices for retaining the support of that community in a small town?
Yeah. Well, I would say one thing is, if your small town's anything like ours, is there's no secrets. You got to be transparent as anything, and you always have to balance off where discretion is around personal information. And we're always pressing that line at times because everyone knows everyone's business. So in our community, most people will know who's in the shelter at any given time. Everyone in the community will know it, and it's a topic of discussion. So we have to be real about that. And we try to stay ahead of it as much as we can. One of the things we do is we won't engage in any social media about the shelter and that kind of thing, but proactively, we'll often do newspaper reports or are on our own website and talk about little things around the shelter. And our goal is to have everyone in the community know what a shelter looks like to run. We've brought people in for tours through the shelter, and it's been random people at times. It's just been people from the community. It's been the nosy neighbor kind of thing. It's getting right on top of that and letting them see and see what's happening in the shelter. And we do that. We've always done that, and we've taken great care for the confidentiality and discretion of people, but also we've most often tried to engage people in the shelter with that as well. And they're fine. They just think, hey, everyone knows who we are anyways. That's not a big deal. But I don't think it takes probably a pretty cold heart to get tours of shelter and see these people that are familiar with them and have a kind of an interaction for people to walk in and say, okay, I get it, I know what it is. So part of it is taking away the fear of the unknown and some of the mythologies around shelter. That's certainly one thing I think about. We give the opportunity for the community to contribute. We used to do a lot of fundraising just to keep our shelter going until we got some core funding. And even when the core funding happened, we made a decision to not stop doing grassroots fundraising. We didn't really need the money, but we kept up the little, in our grocery store, you can give to a certain charity. The shelter, the In From the Cold shelter is still there. We still do little fundraisers, we do that. And for me, it's ways to just connect with people. And so they're feeling connected and actually embracing a bit at the shelter. We've had to do some clarification for two reasons. This is kind of sneaky communication maybe in a way too. We've again pushed a little bit around confidentiality at times there's been an incident in the shelter, and we won't discuss names, but we'll communicate once again to the community when we ban people, what kind of incidents might create some sort of limit there, and we do it for a couple of different reasons. One is so that as people hear that there might have been a particular incident, they're getting a message that we're on it. But they'll also get a message, hey, they have limits there. And although our shelter folks don't necessarily want that, our community loves to hear that we kick people out. Not that they want them in the community, but the constant thing is, they're pampered and they're, all these kind of mythologies. So we will do some reminding that there are limits, there are conditions for people staying, and we actually have barred people at times, and so we kind of get that out in the community where we know it's going to be talked about anyway. So that's probably my biggest one. And neighbors, I don't know how your neighbors are, but yeah, good luck. Keep your neighbors close. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Chloe. I really enjoyed the film. Thank you. I work on Cape Breton Island, and we are lots of the things you said resonated with me. But in a situation where more visible homelessness is kind of new for our community,
right?
And so there's myths that people are being bussed up from Halifax, and this is an urban problem that's being put on our community, and it's not seeing that actually these are just the economic and housing kind of crises that are within our own community and have been here, but now they're just a lot more visible. So I'm just wondering how you deal with that idea that maybe these are urban issues that are coming to our small rural place.
Yeah. There's a myth, an endless narrative in our community that the services in Vancouver and Victoria send people to Salt Spring, and I think that our homeless counts have revealed much the same statistic as is in most communities. Like, it's mostly homegrown people. There's a certain transience, but I think across the country it seems to be common that the majority of the people that are homeless in any given community are from that community, and then there's a certain level. So some of those stats need to be kind of clarified. One of the things I'll tell people often with that one, because someone will say, well, I'm going to stop giving to the food bank, or I'm not going to contribute. That's what they usually say when they confront me on the street. If they think something's off with the shelter, well, I'm stopping donating. And I just say, I really hope when our folks, and it happens lots, when our young people head off, because many people have to leave the island. There's not a lot of work for young people here, so they end up in all sorts of situations in other cities. We got to hope that they're going to be cared for over there. So I think that the trade-off, there's probably just as many Salt Springers toughing it out in Vancouver and in Victoria than there are coming the other way. So there's a couple of different messages I give. But having said that, we have had to message out to different communities not to send people as well. And so we'll definitely send the word out to the different hospitals in our region, so in Nanaimo and Cowichan area and Victoria, when we're chock full and we're getting messaging put through our own health authority back out there and say, as you're discharging people, You just got to know, don't even mention Salt Spring because we're full. And we'll mention that the police are helpful with that too, and they'll get the word out to manage that kind of transiency. But part of it is I think it'll be natural. You will get, and all it'll take is one person from Halifax coming to Cape Breton, and then that'll be the story. You know, so those myths will grow, I'm sure.
Time for one more question,
Sure.
probably.
Hi, I'm from New Brunswick and I work with social development. And I'm also from my rural communities, but we have a Tim Hortons though. And yeah, we've seen a significant increase in homelessness in the last few years. So we're talking about like 50, 60 cases for a 12,000 population. So they asked us to do a point in time, and we were only able to identify 8 persons with the point in time because it was more adapted for within the area.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering how you managed to identify your homelessness case in your region, and how it could be implemented in mine.
Yeah. Well, we've had a long history with point-in-time counts, and not that we've mastered it, but I've got a lot to say about that. And we've had a fairly kind of chronic, permanent homeless situation for quite a long time. So in 2008, we jumped in and did a classic point-in-time count and set the time out and had volunteers and trained them and everything you do to do a proper point-in-time count, and clipboards and coffee cards for people, all those sorts of things. And I think we counted 3. And we knew that it was at least 40. And so we shifted, and I did a little bit of research into how to do those point-in-time counts, and did a complete shift and started talking about particularly events and services centering around people accessing particular services. So we didn't go out to look. We thought, when do they appear and identify themselves on their terms? So we realized we're going out, and our sole purpose is to go count you. And on our terms, we want to know about you. We took a look at when are they connecting with us willfully on their terms, and it was the food bank, and it was our shelter, and it was our early childhood programs, and it was our seniors programs, and all those places started identifying where are people coming forward. And then we set a week time. So it wasn't point-in-time day, it was for a week. We enumerated the people that were interconnecting with all of our services, and then we had like 50 just automatically. And we went and at an early day, ahead of our time, we said, let's do a by name thing too, and create our because we just had hired some staff through what was the homeless partnering strategy back then, now Reaching Home. We had some staff person that can build that person's staff, that list, if those people are willing to do that. So along with identifying them, said, would you like to go be added to our list for that program? And so most people did. There wasn't any additional catches to it, like now it's a little more difficult to get people in because there's a lot of pressure on us to get people on HIFAS, which people are kind of bucking at. But as long as they're doing it on their terms, and we stuck with that, and we've now narrowed it down. The community's gotten used to it, and so it's easier now. We do it. It only takes us 2 days now, and so we've worked with BC Housing and the BC Homelessness Association, who they do the collation of all accounts, and they made sure that our rigor was the same, so it would be a credible number. And so we declare a 2-day period, and it's on that basis of them connecting with these services. We have set services, and there's only 3 different places, 3 different agencies that even participate, so it's kind of easy. Us, the Women's Agency, and the hospital, so we can do this during that particular 2-day period. And what I've noticed when I've looked at other research on point-in-time counts is there's point-in-time counts now in other urban centers. They're adding in events, like they're actually doing things to purposely bring people in for that enumeration as well, instead of walking the streets. So they're kind of coming around to doing that same kind of count. But that's a familiar scenario, because the classic point in time is that doesn't even give us the stat that is accurate.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, folks.
I just wanted to do a quick thank you to Rob for his presentation today and all the knowledge sharing that you've done. 2 quick reminders for everyone. So this presentation will be available on the web-based platform, hopefully today or tomorrow, if you're looking for further information on it. And just the last piece, your opening ceremonies started about 10 minutes ago. So head there, it's at the ballroom. 10-ish minutes because we're behind 15 minutes. So it's in the ballroom, so make sure you go and you have your drink tickets on the back for anyone that's interested. So thank you all for today, and we'll see you tomorrow.